For millennia, humans have adapted to their natural environment. Over time, humans grew to thrive and eventually modified their environment to meet their needs. Native Americans changed from hunting and gathering to clearing portions of their landscape for horticultural fields, growing corn, beans, and squash. Early settlers also cleared areas for agricultural fields, first for limited farming, then for cash crops such as tobacco, wheat, corn, and cotton. Eventually, landscapes were modified to accommodate growing towns, expanding transportation routes, and military training activities. The interrelationship between human adaptation and landscape use and environmental modification is examined here through a unique grassland ecosystem that continues to exist within the Fort Campbell military installation. This grassland is known as the Barrens. Perhaps we would not know today what the Barrens were like long ago if the early European and American settlers to cross the landscape had not left written accounts of what they saw. Jedediah Morris, considered the father of American geography, explored the area in 1793 and offered one of the first written descriptions of the Barrens.
In Nelson Country, northwest of Rolling Fork, is a tract about 40 miles square, mostly barren, interspersed with plains and strips of good land. These lands are covered with grass and afford good pasturage.
André Michel, a noted French botanist, recorded his observations of the Barrens in a diary entry dated June 12, 1795.
I passed through a country covered with grass and oaks which no longer exist as forests, having been burned every year. These lands are called barren lands, although not really sterile. The grasses predominate.
Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, who later became King of France, crossed the Barrens in 1797.
One sees only small stunted trees, most of them oaks and hickories, and everywhere lush grass dotted with charming flowers.
Well before European exploration of the area, ancestral Cherokees had inhabited the southern Appalachian summit and uplands for thousands of years. By the 18th century, the Cherokee lived in autonomous towns in 4 major areas: Lower, Middle, Valley, and Overhill. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Cherokee had expanded into northeastern Alabama. Ancestral Cherokee lands also included portions of Virginia, West Virginia, and most of Kentucky. The Barrens were part of the Cherokee hunting grounds under the stewardship of the Overhill towns in eastern Tennessee. The Overhill Cherokee could reach the hunting grounds in less than 4 or 5 days. They supplemented a diet based on crops grown in the floodplains near the towns with bison, elk, and other game hunted in the Barrens. The strong sense of Cherokee stewardship and reliance upon the lands containing the Barrens is best illustrated by an impassioned speech made by a prominent Overhill warrior named Siugunshini, or Dragging Canoe. In 1775, during land negotiations at Sycamore Shoals, Tennessee, during the second day of negotiations with the Transylvania Land Company challenging the illegal land cessions agreement, Dragging Canoe walked to the center of the treaty grounds and said,
"Whole Indian nations have melted away like snowballs in the sun before the white man's advance. They leave scarcely a name of our people except those wrongly recorded by their destroyers. We had hoped that the white man would not be willing to travel beyond the mountains. Now that hope is gone. They have passed the mountains and have settled upon Tsalagi land. They wish to have that usurpation now sanctioned by treaty. When that is gained, the same encroaching spirit will lead them upon other land of the Tsalagi. New cessions will be asked. Finally, the whole country which the Tsalagi and their fathers have so long occupied will be demanded, and the remnant of the Aniyunwiya, the real people, once so great and formidable, will be compelled to seek refuge in some distant wilderness. There they will be permitted to stay only a short while, until they again behold the advancing banners of the same greedy host. Not being able to point out any further retreat for the miserable Tsalagi, the extinction of the whole race will be proclaimed. Should we not therefore run all risks and incur all consequences rather than to submit to further loss of our country. Such treaties may be all right for men who are too old to hunt or fight. As for me, I have my young warriors about me. We will hold our land. The records indicate that Dragon Canoe, to Yungun Chini, he is Dragon Canoe. He said, "You have sold our birthright. You have sold our hunting grounds." And so I think it's more than just the hunting grounds to get the bison, more than to get the elk or the deer. It was essentially one of the last straws to where to be a man, to be a Cherokee man, it was taken from them. The world we're stepping into is an organized world. Women have one role and men have another role. And when you take away part of your role, how do you define yourself as a man? And so when the American Revolution was beginning, I think that the selling of the Barrens area, that karst landscape, was what really drove them over the edge.
Dragon Canoe's speech had such a strong influence on the headmen that they closed the Treaty Council without more talk. However, in the end, the Transylvania Land Company purchased 20 million acres of land from the Cherokee, including the Cumberland River watershed and lands on the Kentucky River, all of eastern and central Kentucky. Their rights to maintain and use their hunting grounds were lost. Whereas the Barrens were a critical part of the Cherokee hunting lands, the early settlers initially viewed the grasslands quite differently. Settlers came to the area toward the end of the 1700s. Farmsteads were established in locations with good soil that were reasonably level and well drained, with a supply of timber and a source of permanent fresh water. The Barrens were initially avoided as farmstead locations because of their lack of trees, intermittent drainages, and presumed unsuitability for agricultural endeavors based on the type of predominant existing vegetation. As agriculture developed, tobacco and, to a lesser extent, cotton dominated the crops. The Virginians and Carolinians largely transplanted their tobacco and mixed farming tradition to southern Kentucky and middle Tennessee. This area became known as the Black Patch because the dark green, heavy-leafed tobacco was fire-cured after harvesting, giving it a dark, almost black appearance. This type of tobacco was favored by Europeans for chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco, and snuff because of its dark color and deep flavor.
When the early settlers came, I think they found a landscape that looks very similar to what we see right here today. Now, obviously, they had mule-drawn equipment and oxen and horse-drawn equipment, and they began to raise tobacco. That was the primary cash crop. They raised corn, they raised some wheat, they had vegetables and orchards, and they made whiskey. So they really didn't change. There was no mechanized equipment to speak of, so they didn't change the landscape very much like farmers do today, where they would actually modify the landscape.
In about 1860, the small-scale farms started to be smaller communities, and they were closer in proximity to one another. Around the turn of the century, that's when the smaller communities started with the infrastructure and the roads and the stores and the post offices, and they were established communities at that time.
By the early 20th century, modern techniques in agricultural production gave rise to growth and the establishment of rural communities across southern Kentucky and northern Tennessee. While tobacco remained a cash crop in the early 1900s, farmers began breeding livestock and raising poultry to supplement their tobacco income. The Barrens were modified for use as agricultural fields and then further encroached upon by the development of communities and the establishment of transportation routes. Predominantly rural, the area was well occupied during the years immediately preceding the construction of Fort Campbell. 84 small farming communities have been identified in the Fort Campbell area. The railway and national highways played a large role in the government selecting a site within this region for a military reservation. In 1942, the federal government acquired an extensive rural portion of northern Tennessee and southern Kentucky for the creation of an Army training installation. Entire communities and individual family farmsteads were relocated, leaving behind farm buildings, residences, schools, churches, provisional stores, and over 200 cemeteries. That acquisition when the United States was preparing for its involvement in World War II was the genesis of Fort Campbell. Because the nation's armed forces needed to quickly mobilize in the fight against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the military had to develop and construct dozens of new training facilities across the country. The construction of Camp Campbell began in early 1942, and the first soldiers began training there that summer. Camp Campbell remained in service after World War II, transitioning to Fort Campbell, a permanent Army post, in 1950. With the establishment of Fort Campbell, the Barrens were changed from agricultural fields back to open space. The vast Fort Campbell military installation covers more than 100,000 acres, straddling the western reaches of the Kentucky-Tennessee state line. Just over 12% of the installation is developed, which includes all of the facilities to house and provide services to support the troops stationed there. The remainder of the base consists of an undeveloped rear area used for military training. Here, natural settings are maintained to provide a realistic context for training activities. This undeveloped area primarily consists of two types of ecological systems: hardwood forests and the unique open grasslands historically referred to as the Barrens. The continued use of the Barrens by the Army is a vital component of the current mission. Fort Campbell's primary mission is to support the training, mobilization, and deployment of mission-ready forces. The installation is home to the 101st Airborne Division, which conducts air assault and is renowned for its D-Day landings in World War II. The open agricultural fields and the Barrens are utilized for artillery ranges and drop zones.
It's very important for the units at Fort Campbell to practice, to train how they're going to execute their missions when they actually get into combat. So the idea in the training complex is to create an environment for the units that, as close as possible, replicates the environment they're going to face when they get into combat.
Before the construction of Fort Campbell, and before settlers built farms and communities in the area it now occupies, the landscape was much different. The first Europeans who explored the area described a unique landscape that has been largely lost over time, drawing the attention of modern-day academic researchers now seeking to understand and restore the original landscape.
The Pennyroyal Plain Prairie, sometimes called the Big Barrens, is the largest grassland in the sort of east central United States. At one time there were about 3.7 million acres. It's hard to believe, but this area was about 200 miles long and up to 35 miles wide. And for most people, I think in the eastern United States today, that's an unfathomable landscape. If we still had that landscape, I think most of us, if we could imagine, it would rival the grandeur of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Early explorers reported that the Barrens were dominated by blue-stem grasses, a variety of small shrubs such as sumac and American hazelnut, and scattered isolated individuals or groves of scrubby oaks and hickories. Two opposing theories have been developed on the creation and continued existence of the Barrens. Some research points to the Barrens as a man-made phenomena, the result of Native American tribes using fire to modify the forest landscape. Other research suggests that the Barrens are a natural occurrence related to existing soil conditions from the underlying Mississippian limestone, regenerated by fire, whether naturally through lightning strikes or intentionally from Native Americans setting fires. Research by Jerry and Carol Baskin of the University of Kentucky School of Biological Sciences and Edward Chester, Emeritus Professor of Plant Taxonomy and Plant Ecology at Austin Peay University, points to the Barrens originating during the prehistoric period, resulting from fires deliberately set by Native Americans. Evidence from pollen studies suggests that the Barrens may have been created as early as 3,000 to 4,000 years ago when grass pollen becomes more prevalent and pollen from forest vegetation diminishes. The possibility that such a vast ecosystem was the result of human behavior is significant in terms of understanding how prehistoric populations impacted the regional environment. Native Americans began modifying their landscape with the clearing of small fields for horticulture around 2,000 years ago, and then expanding to larger agricultural fields on the floodplains about 1,500 years ago. Planting and cultivation was the responsibility of women's work groups. Men assisted in clearing the fields by girdling the trees and by controlled use of fire to clear fields. Towns emerged as settlement near the agricultural centers increased. By the 18th century, the Cherokee recognized 7 mother towns that were the locations of major regional religious ceremonies. Gadua Mound, located south of Cherokee, North Carolina, is considered the most sacred of the mother towns, as this is the birthplace of the Cherokee people and location where the Cherokee first received fire and sacred laws. The sacred flame of the Cherokee was tended at the Gadua Mound. During late July or early August each year, the green corn ceremony took place, where the old fire was extinguished and the new fire was ritually prepared. The sacred fires were carried home in specially designed ceramic vessels. Native Americans are known to have used fire to clear land for horticulture, but their use of fire associated with hunting of big game animals is less defined. Periodic burning to clear the land of woody vegetation would provide open vistas to spot and shoot prey at a distance. Managing the grasslands through fire would create suitable grazing and browsing habitat for large herbivores such as bison.
What this area was traditionally used for in the ethnohistory and in the historical records is for a hunting ground of multiple tribes. Looking at the ethnohistory, a large hunting ground for multiple tribes dovetails in with the practice of clearing the land through fire for a use. And the use that makes sense and meets with all the data points that we have is clearing for some type of hunting ground management.
Well, as far as their creation and maintenance, something had to do it. We do know that when the first settlers came, fortunately, they kept some good notes, and they said, we're going to follow what the Native Americans did. We're going to burn those things every year.
Evidence for the use of fire to clear the barrens comes from first-hand observations in historic accounts. In 1802, Francois-André Michaud remarked that
the custom of burning the meadows was formerly practiced by the natives who came in this part of the country to hunt. Their aim in setting fire to it is to allure the stags, bison, etc. into the parts which are burned, where they can discern them at a greater distance.
We know from early accounts by settlers like Mr. John Ross, who was one of the early settlers in Montgomery County, that he directly observed Native American burning on a yearly basis. André Michaud in the late 1790s called attention to it. So the work by Dr. Frost that advocates for lightning having a major role is important. However, we should take sort of a middle of the road approach in that we know that both probably played a role here. And one important thing to consider is prior to 12,500 years ago, or maybe 15,000 years ago, before Native Americans came into this region, lightning would have been the only force to keep the grasslands of the southeast open.
the importance of fire in the maintenance of the barrens is undisputed. Both fires intentionally set by Native Americans and lightning fires were important for the regeneration of the grassland species. Frequent fires in the barrens prevented the growth of trees and replenished the soil with nutrients that, in turn, provided habitat for hundreds of species of plants and food for a variety of animals. Over the past 2 centuries, the barrens' footprint has been reduced by more than 99%. With the displacement of the Native American tribes in this area and the likely decrease in establishing fires to revive the barrens, forests quickly overtook the grasslands. Currently, outside of Fort Campbell, there are very few and widely scattered remnants of the barrens, totaling less than 100 acres altogether. 4 primary factors have contributed to the loss of the original prairie-like landscape: cultivation, absence of regular fire, introduction of invasive species, and development and construction. However, protected within the Fort Campbell military installation's boundaries are 7,400 acres of land that provide the best remaining example of the barren landscape settlers first saw more than 2 centuries ago. The Barrens at Fort Campbell have been thoroughly studied by Dr. Chester and others, who evaluated 22 remnants and documented 311 native species.
Dr. Wayne Chester is my mentor. His work was really foundational in that it told us what was here. But we don't yet have an understanding of how those different species occur in different assemblages. So the dry prairie of the tops, the mesic or moist prairie of the mid-slopes, and the wet prairie down at the bottoms, how do they relate to these species and soils and landscapes and topography? That's sort of the next frontier of what we need to work on.
Doctors Chester and Estes believe the Barrens survive today because of Fort Campbell. The Army has saved the grassland that would have likely remained in agricultural use or had been lost to suburban development. Since the 1950s, the uncultivated fields were maintained through a regular, rotating, prescribed burn schedule. Earth and fire breaks prevented fire from escaping fields to allow control of burn areas.
Prescribed fire vents utilize a bog line around the fire unit. The bog line consists of bare ground and it's normally 10 feet wide. That fire line prevents the fire from leaving the unit.
About 70 to 80% of the undeveloped area at Fort Campbell was open grass or agricultural land, with only about 20% forested.
The Army, as part of their activities to keep these fields open for training exercise, they've got to have fields here. You know, they don't want woods. If they're going to train paratroopers and other people, they've got to have open areas to do that in. So their burning just fits right in with the Barrens.
Barren management on Fort Campbell began in the late 1990s after an intensive study conducted by the Nature Conservancy. That study basically laid out where all the barrens were on Fort Campbell. Following that, we built a management plan to keep those barrens in the pristine condition they were in, and we utilized prescribed fire, disking, which is basically a disc pulled behind a tractor and brings it down to mineral earth, or mowing. Unfortunately, the best remaining barrens on Fort Campbell are in the impact areas. They are burned regularly through military training. Other than that, we have barrens on the eastern portion of the installation that are mowed and burned on a 1 to 3 year rotation.
The plans balance requirements to support the military mission along with goals for sustaining a natural ecosystem and associated plants and wildlife. Even with management plans in place, the habitat can change rapidly as deciduous forest will emerge in areas where tree growth is not checked in time, in as little as 2 to 3 years. The Cultural Resources Management Program at Fort Campbell conducts archaeological investigations at the installation to identify and preserve information about Native Americans and early pioneers who once occupied the region.
Well, the Barrens is one of the more unique pieces of history that involves Fort Campbell. Normally, when archaeologists think of archaeological sites, we look at a site. It's a town, it's a village, it's a campsite, resource extraction. The Barrens is a landscape that was managed by people for thousands of years.
The Barrens at Fort Campbell are primarily managed today by the Army as a natural resource. However, theories suggest they are also a landscape modified by humans in both the prehistoric and historic periods, making them a cultural resource as well.
Well, the Cultural Resources Program at Fort Campbell generally deals with compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. Essentially what we try to do here is to identify archaeological sites and historic structures that Fort Campbell owns, evaluate the ones that are important for history, and then we try to manage for them as appropriate. And to do that, we have to know which ones are important, so we have to build a larger, broader context. We manage these resources in partnership with the state, local historical societies. We deal with 12 federally recognized Native American tribes, and making these decisions are what are important for the Army to manage in this context.
Although no federally recognized tribes live on lands or reservations within or near Fort Campbell, many tribes retain a legally supported interest in activities on lands they once occupied. Tribes like the Cherokee work with cultural resource specialists at the base to consider the impacts on resources and the lands they once occupied. Fort Campbell has entered into agreements with Tennessee and Kentucky wildlife agencies to cooperate on efforts to reestablish, enhance, and protect native warm-season grasses on the installation and to allow the harvest of seeds. The military reservation cooperates with research institutions to facilitate research on habitat and land management techniques that support military training while also promoting the maintenance and reestablishment of naturally occurring native grass barrens. Dr. Estes points out the benefits that could be reaped by protection and restoration of the barrens. They provide a visual link to the story of how humans shaped the landscape centuries ago and how it influenced early settlement in the late 1700s. Today, Dr. Estes and his team lead efforts to reintroduce or expand prairie grasslands in a number of existing parks and greenways in the region. Access to the barrens at Fort Campbell is critical to such efforts, and the Army is committed to managing these unique grasslands as part of mission training, which will ensure future generations can witness and benefit from the barrens for years to come.